This is Lucy Morgan, and we're going to start our second video in Module 2 and look at some ways that the grant cycle is affected by the change in the grant regulations to the new OMB Super Circular. Now, I know in the last video I mentioned that we were going to walk through the grant cycle in less than 5 minutes, but I hope you don't mind. We've added some bonus material, and so it's going to take us a little more than 5 minutes to get through, but we hopefully will get through this whole thing in less than 10 minutes and highlight all of the major areas in the grant cycle that you need to be aware of as this implementation gets underway. So the grant cycle typically starts in the pre-federal award phase and then moves into the period of performance, and that's where the heavy lifting of grant management happens. Then finally there's a closeout process. Now with the new OMB Super Circular, this process and this cycle has really not changed, but there are some areas in the cycles that we want to talk about so that you're aware of how things may be impacted by the change to the new grant regulations. Okay, let's look at the grant cycle in further depth, and we're going to look specifically at some impact points in the pre-federal award part of the cycle, the period of performance where most of the heavy lifting for grant management happens, and then the closeout period. In the pre-federal award, you'll see a notice of funding opportunity that is going to start to look a little different. And that's because they're going to include both performance measurements and a risk assessment framework in the notice of funding opportunity. The goal is to have more transparency to organizations who are applying for federal awards in what the expectations are and how the awards will be judged for merit and risk and things like that right in the funding opportunity, so everyone knows what rules they're playing with. The second area is in the review of merit by funding agencies. Now, the review of merit is nothing new, but there's going to be additional transparency and focus on performance measurements during this review. The third area is the review of risk, and this is something that's going to happen both by the federal agencies and also by any pass-through entities. Now, this is a new requirement that risk be assessed prior to awarding any money, both on the federal agency level and then also for pass-throughs. So if you're a pass-through entity, you want to pay attention on this one. Now, we don't know exactly what that's going to look like, but as that comes onto some of the notice of funding opportunities, hopefully in the fall, but certainly by the time the new regulations are instituted, we'll have a better idea of what that's going to look like, and then a good model for building that for your own organization if you are a pass-through entity. The final area in the pre-federal award cycle that I wanted to talk about was the introduction of some new innovative approaches. And what this includes is something called a fixed cost award. And this is where they are focusing more on the performance of the objectives and less on compliance. So that's something new where you would be awarded a certain amount of money to achieve the objectives, and less time would be spent focused in on the compliance aspect of that. We'll see how that goes. It is something new, but it is an exciting approach. They've also introduced some innovative approaches when it comes to indirect costs, with some new ways to have indirect costs provided you, especially if you are a new organization, to federal awards. The second part of the grant cycle is in the period of performance. Now, this again is going to have much more of a focus on performance measurements than ever before, and also internal controls. In the past, internal controls was something that was relegated more to the audit and accounting and finance areas, and they've made a shift in their thinking to bring that into every part of the grant cycle to make sure that internal controls are in place and are working as expected. The next area in the period of performance that you need to be aware of has to do with procurement. And this is where there's been some changes in everything from contract provisions and also how we're making sure that women, minority, and other disadvantaged groups are involved in federal dollars. And so that's something that you'll want to make sure you have, take a look at that for your organization and update anything that needs to be updated. There's also a new focus on monitoring and reporting. And this includes everything from more sub-award monitoring, but also something new, which is a certification of costs, which has been beefed up from what it used to be, and in some cases there wasn't a certification of costs. But the big thing to notice on this new form of certification of costs at reporting is that you have to have it's certified by an official who can legally bind the organization. So that's something that's a little different than what you may have seen in the past, and you need to be aware of it. Another area has to do with how information technology and the internet has changed the world for grant recipients. And this has to do with protected information. As most of us know, more and more things of data of potentially personally identifiable information is ending up on the internet, and the federal government wants to make sure that grant recipients are protecting that personally identifiable information as well as other sensitive information. The final area in the period of performance that I wanted to make you aware of is the new focus on family-friendly policies. This came out of a desire, it's a public policy requirement, to encourage women in the science and technology fields, and there's a number of changes both in the cost principles as well as policy requirements having to do with family-friendly policies. And finally, in closeout, there are some new audit thresholds that you need to be aware of to make sure that you are compliant with those and are even subject to them, because in some cases you may not have to have a single Audit Act audit. They're strengthening oversight. There's a new emphasis on resolving findings, and then also more and more data transmission and analysis is going to happen through the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. And I also wanted to make you aware of some new concepts that affect the various parts of the grant cycle. In the pre-federal award, there's this concept of performance over compliance, and we're seeing that through the fixed price awards, where a certain amount is going to be awarded. And I believe in the last slide I called that a fixed cost award, but that's actually a fixed price award. And then there's this new 10% de minimis indirect cost rate, which will be available to organizations that have not previously had a negotiated cost rate agreement in place. In the period of performance, we talked a little bit about this certification of costs. This is a new thing for nonprofits and for state and local governments. Institutions of higher education have had something similar to this, but not quite as beefed up. And so that's happening in the period of performance. There's also finally a resolution on the issue of our computer supplies or equipment if they're under the capitalization limit, and that was made clear that if they're under the capitalization limit that they are supplies, they're not some kind of weird hybrid between supplies and equipment. And there's also some public policy things about encouraging efficient use of information technology and possibly working across agencies and things like that to make sure that information technology services are shared where that will make the grants more efficient. And finally, in closeout, the Federal Audit Clearinghouse is getting beefed up as the information repository for federal awards. And the federal government is going to be bringing online new analytics to help the federal agencies determine if there is findings that are happening year after year after year, and also across agencies. So it will be much more transparent to the federal agencies who has audit findings and who is not taking care of those audit findings. So those are also new concepts in the new grant regulations that we wanted to make you aware of. So that is a real quick run through of what areas are impacted in the grant cycle. In our next video 3, we're going to look at 5 other areas that we're just going to delve down into a little more so that you get a little more of the information behind some of the changes and that you can be watching out for those kind of gotchas. And so we'll see you in video 3.